He who has never uttered one word twice, first made the earth, and after them there came not better earths, but beasts. Then there arise not nobler beasts, but spirits. Then he dies their death to save the fallen. But these shall be not mended, but clothed on in paradise with new creation fashioned gloriously. So change itself is changed forever. Blessed be he.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 23, Venusian Verse, After Hours with Dr. Don W. King. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack, your favourite C.S. Lewis podcast run by three Thalkandrians. Today, we are continuing with our after-hour interviews. And in this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Don W. King, who has been on the show several times before to talk about Joy Davidman, Warnie Lewis, as well as Jack's poetry. But today we're going to be talking about someone else's poetry, but in connection to Perelandra, that being the poet Miss Ruth Pitter. But first, let me just reintroduce our guest today. Dr. Don W. King has been on the faculty of Montreat College since 1974, where he is a faculty fellow and professor of English. From 1999 to 2015, he served as editor of the Christian Scholars Review. His 90-plus essays and reviews have appeared in many different publications, including Seven and the Journal of Inkling Studies, and he's also the author of many books, which include Inkling Historian Soldier and Brother, A Life of Warren Hamilton Lewis, Out of My Bone, The Letters of Joy Davidman, The Collected Poems of C.S. Lewis, a critical edition, and Sudden Heaven, The Collected Poems of Ruth Pitter, a critical edition. Dr. King, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, David. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, exactly. What have you been up to since you were actually last on the show?
Well, I've actually been spending a lot more time working on Joy Davidman material. Very briefly, when I published her letters in 2009, at the time we published all the letters that were available. But since that time, several small collections have become available. The most interesting for your listeners are the letters that Joy wrote during her first trip to England, where she met C.S. Lewis for the first time. So those letters, those unpublished letters, are going to appear in Seven, the Journal of the Marion E. Wade Center, any time now.
Wonderful.
So I think a lot of readers will be interested in that. I also published Joy's poems in 2015, but because of the nature of what I was trying to do with that book, which was to focus on Joy's love sonnets to C.S. Lewis, I withheld 31 poems at that time. So my most recent two projects are to publish the rest of Joy's unpublished poetry. One of those articles is entitled Frankenstein's Nursery Rhymes, and it will appear in Zenzuk, I think in 2025. And the other piece, just two poems here, I'm publishing this under the name of Amor Agonistes, the love sonnets of Louise Labbe and Joy Davidman. And that's going to appear in the Journal of Inkling's Studies. I've also got a piece on C.S. Lewis's poetry coming out in the Rutledge Companion to C.S. Lewis. And I recently published a review of Diana Gleyer's book, The Major and the Missionary, the letters of Warren Hamilton Lewis and Blanche Biggs. That's also going to appear in the Journal of Inkling's Studies. So I'm not working on a book right now, but I've been pretty busy with these essays, as you can see.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I am drinking an Athletic Brewing non-alcoholic beer. It's called Round of Cheers. What are you drinking?
I've got a mug of apple cider.
Oh, lovely. My son has actually recently just discovered apple cider. It's one of his new favorite drinks.
Oh, nice.
So you are in good company. Cheers.
Cheers.
So as I was explaining before we hit record, when I started planning for this season, I had come across your paper. It's called The Poetry of Prose, C.S. Lewis, Ruth Pitter, and Perelandra. And it was actually the first thing I'd read in preparation for this season. And I was tempted to start introducing that material early on, I delayed until I thought we'll be later in the book and everything will make more sense. And then by the time we got there, I realized, nope, I'm doing this incorrectly. I just need to get Don King on at the end of the season and he can talk us through it all. So let's do that today. Let's begin by talking about Ruth Pitter. Who was she and how did she intersect with C.S. Lewis?
Sure, very glad to do that. Ruth Pitter was a well-known and critically acclaimed 20th century poet who published 20th century British poet who published 18 volumes of poetry. She actually earned her living in London as an artisan by painting furniture and running a business. The business was called Dean and Forster with her lifelong friend Kathleen O'Hara. Pitter lived in London and Chelsea. It's sort of a conclave for artists. And that was very problematic during World War II. Because of the war, she eventually had to stop working as an artisan and began working in a munitions factory. The pressure of nightly bombings, the Blitz, as some of your audience will recognize, and being denied being able to work as an artisan caused her to become at that time increasingly depressed. Yet as she cleared complete despair, unsolicited hope came from an unlikely source, at least for her at that time, and that was she heard the BBC radio broadcasts of C.S. Lewis, later published as Mere Christianity. About that, she recalls, there were air raids at night. The factory was dark and dirty. And I remember thinking, well, I must find somebody or something because like this, I cannot go on. I stopped in the middle of the Battersea Bridge one dreadful March night when it was cold. And I think that was probably like 1944, by the way. And the wind was howling over the bridge and it was as dark as the pit. And I stood and leaned against the parapet and thought, like this, I cannot go on. And by the way, David, just previous to when she wrote this, someone had committed suicide by jumping off that bridge. Anyway, back to what she says. And it didn't come to me at once, but sometime afterwards I heard the broadcast talks of C.S. Lewis, and I at once grappled them to my soul, as Shakespeare says. And I used to assemble the family to hear because I thought they were so good that even from the point of view of enjoyment, people shouldn't miss them. And I got every word of his that I could. And I could see by hard argument that there was only one way for it. I had to be intellectually satisfied as well as emotionally, because at that time of life, and she was in her early 40s, one doesn't just fall into it, that is, into Christianity, in adolescent emotion. And I was satisfied at every point that it was the one way and the hard way to do things. Now, Pitter's conversion to Christianity was still several years away, but hearing Lewis on the radio was a critical step down the path to Christian faith for her. After this, Pitter had what she thought was an impossible desire to meet Lewis, but her meeting him was fortuitously advanced when another minor poet, at this time a man named Herbert Palmer, and he was a friend of both Lewis and Pitter, began corresponding with Lewis in the autumn of 1945, and Palmer soon agreed to help Pitter meet Lewis. In a letter of November 45, in which she comments briefly on several of Lewis's books, including The Pilgrim's Regress, Pitter writes Palmer, "Are you really going to see Lewis? One of the few people it's worth getting excited over. I know he's a good poet. I dare say he never heard of me, but I wish you would tell him that his work is the joy of my life. One's homesickness for heaven finds at least an inn there, and it is an inn on the right road. You're absolutely right about his importance." She finishes by saying, "He is portentous." Briefly, Palmer replied and said Lewis was surprised to learn of her interest in him. And Pitter writes to Pitter and quotes from a letter that Lewis had sent to him. And Lewis says, "I'm astonished at what Miss Pitter says, and most deeply rejoiced to find that my work is not, as her rash kindness betrayed her into saying, the joy of her life, but the occasion which sometimes awakes that joy into activity. The little I have seen of her poetry I admire very greatly. Pitter, as you can imagine, was quite taken by this compliment, and she wrote back to Palmer and said, "I'm quite exalted at receiving a message from C.S. Lewis, for whom my enthusiasm is of a kind I thought dead in my bosom. Haven't felt anything like it for 30 years."
Wonderful.
One wonders if there was some kind of appreciation of Lewis beyond simply the intellectual and the spiritual in a quote like that. But anyway, Palmer then replies, he writes again, and he further invites Pitter's anticipation when, again, Palmer quotes from a letter that Lewis wrote to him about Pitter. Palmer writes, "C.S. Lewis sends you his duty and says you may see him when you like." So Pitter writes back to Palmer and says, "Many thanks for the kind messages from C.S. Lewis. I will write him and ask if I may go to see him. And in this prospect, I feel more excitement and more diffidence than I have felt since the age of 18 or so." Pitter then writes Lewis and asks to meet him. In his response to her letter, he's quite surprised that she was hesitant in asking for the meeting. He writes, "But what should you be trepidant about? Calling on a middle-aged don, I can't imagine." So Pitter actually meets Lewis for the first time in July of 1945. They had a nice visit together. He wanted more of her poems, so she wrote him back, and she writes, "I have hunted out these," and these were several volumes of her poetry. "I've hunted these out wishing you to see something more than the recent Trophy of Arms," one of her publications that had just appeared, "and particularly that you should see A Mad Lady's Garland," another one of her volumes, "which, though only grotesque and satirical, think is my best and most original. Please keep the other two if you have a mind to them, but perhaps I may have the Garland back sometime, as it's the only copy I have right now. My visit to you, Mr. Lewis, has discounted all of the gypsy's warnings of people who say, 'Never meet your favorite authors,' or they are so disappointing." And then she signs off by writing, "With heartfelt thanks." So quickly, Lewis reads A Trophy of Arms, and he writes Pitter in response, "Trophy is enough for one letter, for it has most deeply delighted me. I was prepared for the more definitely mystical poems, but not for this cool classical quality. You do it time after time, create a silence and vacancy and all around the poem." I love this next line, by the way, David. Lewis writes, "If the lady in Comus had written poetry, one imagines it would have been rather like this." And then he goes on to comment on several of his favorite poems. And he then says, "Why wasn't I told you were as good as this?" It's hard not to imagine the thrill Pitter received upon reading Lewis's high praise, particularly since she admired him as a writer, scholar, and sage, ever mindful of how his radio broadcasts and books had nurtured her own faith. So that's the beginning of their correspondence. And then Lewis begins sending his poems to Lewis for a critique, because she was the well-known and critically acclaimed poet. Lewis at this time was still struggling with his poetry, very committed to it. But again, she was the well-known poet. He was the wannabe poet in a way. So after thanking her for taking the time to respond to some of the poems he sent her, he says he's relieved that she found the poems effective, and then confesses that in most of these poems, I am enamored of metrical subtleties, not as a game. The truth is I often lust after a meter, as a man might lust after a woman. I love that line. So Lewis continues then writing Pitter regularly about his own verse, asking for her opinion between different versions of the same poem, admiring her native ability and appreciating her critical insights. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that in many ways Pitter became Lewis's mentor as a poet.
Later this season, we're going to be doing Charles Williams Month. So I've been preparing for that at the moment. And Lewis and Charles, they have also a very warm beginning to their relationship when they discover each other and just heap praise on each other. But I think that in comparison to that, Pitter's stuff is turned up to 11. It's wonderful seeing Lewis enthuse so much about this author who was trepidatious about even reaching out to him in the first place.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Lewis's work and the beginnings of Perelandra, because that also began in poetry.
Right.
Would you mind just telling us the story of that?
Sure. Walter Hooper suggests that Perelandra may have had its genesis in poetic form, and he cites the only surviving fragment of the poem Lewis apparently started when he was working on Perelandra. It's just 6 or 7 lines, and here they are. The floating islands, the flat golden sky at noon, the peacock sunset, tepid waves with the land sliding over them like a skin, the alien Eve, green-bodied, stepping forth to meet my hero from her forest home, proud, courteous, unafraid, no thought infirm alters her cheek. And I love that kind of opening as well, because it picks up on so many things that we find in Perelandra. In explaining further what stimulated his writing the story, Lewis connects it to his poetic impulse of conceiving images. He writes, the starting point for my second novel, Perelandra, was my mental pictures of floating islands. The whole of the rest of my labors, in a sense, consisted in building up a world in which floating islands could exist. In my view, and I've read Perelandra at least a half dozen times, and last summer I actually listened to it again, but in my view, Perelandra is filled with what I would call poetic prose. That is, ordinary spoken and written language, prose, that makes use of cadence, rhythm, figurative language, and other devices ordinarily associated with poetry. And indeed, I think that Perelandra contains some of the most sustained poetic prose that Lewis ever wrote. Obviously, the majority of the book is prose narrative, but I think about a quarter of the novel could be deemed poetic. One critic, Thomas Peter, claims that Perelandra reads like poetry. And then writing about the Ransom trilogy, Kath Filmer argues that Lewis's frequent use of metaphor in his poetry is readily transferred to his prose. His fiction, she contends, has, quote, that imaginative magical quality that he failed to express in his poetry. In the novel itself, as you'll probably recall, Ransom, in recalling all that he saw on Perelandra, corrects Lewis, that is the character in the novel, for assuming that, quote, it's all too vague for you to put in words. On the contrary, it is words that are vague. The reason why the thing can't be expressed is that it's too definite for language. And I would argue, in fact, I have argued, that Chapter 3 in its entirety of Perelandra and much of Chapter 4 can be cited as evidence of this claim, for there Lewis creates verbal pictures of the paradisal environment that Ransom enjoys. And what he writes in those passages, I think, is a lyrical shower of poetic prose that's unprecedented in his fiction and characterized by a cloudburst of figurative language, including effusive metaphors, similes, and symbols.
I had read Perelandra just once before we did this season, and I had taken it down in one big gulp. I think I read it in the space of a few days. I just finished Out of the Silent Planet, and it's like, all right, what happens next? Going through it this time was easier and harder in some ways, because I've said throughout, I think this is Lewis's best prose, hands down, anywhere.
I totally and absolutely agree with you.
But I found the whole experience very tiring, very rewarding. But you're flipping between deep philosophy, having to sort of mentally translate the conversations that they're having, because the words they're using aren't the words that we would normally use. And then you keep jumping off into these beautiful descriptions, typically of either the woman or the land.
Yeah.
That, as you say, is much more poetic. And so reading it this time, a chapter at a time, much, much more slowly, has been much more rewarding. it's a full meal. It's a very rich meal reading Perelandra. And I say it constantly, Lewis needs to be read slowly, but I would say this book in particular for that very reason.
As you were talking, I was thinking in the same way that it's a meal. It's an enjoyable meal, and that's why I like to go back to it so often. People often ask me, what are your favorite books by C.S. Lewis? And I say, well, the ones that I reread the most are the Screwtape Letters, because I need to be corrected so many times. And then Perelandra, just because to me, it's just so beautiful. And as you suggested, it's a feast.
Yeah. Well, now we've spoken about the origin of Perelandra and its poetic nature. Can you tell us about how Ruth Pitter responded to Perelandra in particular and the project which came out of it?
Sure. She had a very deep admiration for Perelandra once she read it. That experience led her to ask Lewis if she might transcribe the ending of the novel into Spenserian stanzas. Spenserian stanza, for your listeners who might not be familiar with what that is, it's a stanza comprised of 9 lines. The first 8 lines are in iambic pentameter, and they rhyme A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C. And then the 9th line also has the C rhyme, but it's written in an iambic hexameter, often called an Alexandrian. So Pitter at one point recalls in her journal, she writes, I had been transcribing the paean of praise towards the end of Perelandra into irregular Spenserian stanzas simply as a mnemonic. I wished so much to have these enormous transcendental ideas in a form I could memorize and use wherever I happened to be. So she writes Lewis about that. And at first he's amused. He writes back and he says, I'm rather shocked at your wasting your verse on my prose. But this soon gives way to curiosity. And so he asks Pitter, when am I to see the Spenserians? 2 months later, he responds to Pitter's Spenserian transcriptions and he says, I like them. And you manage to be closer to the original in the verse than some of my continental translators seem to get in prose. So in the end, she composed 23 Spenserian stanzas based on roughly 4 of the last pages, the last 4 of the last prose pages in the last chapter of Perelandra. Now, I'd like to share a little story about how I discovered these transcriptions, if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely.
When I was working on my first book, Lewis as a Poet, the thesis of that book ended up being that Lewis is a good poet, and his best poetry might be found in his prose. So I was at the Bodleian doing research, and I'd heard a little about Ruth Pitter at the time, but I didn't know much about her. Anyway, I came across the correspondence between the two of them that I just shared with you about her wanting to write transcriptions of those last pages in Perelandra. And I thought, well, wow, that kind of supports the thesis of my book that Lewis's best poetry is found in his prose. I contacted the Lewis estate and said, do you know anything about Ruth Pitter's transcriptions at the end of Perelandra? And of course, they knew nothing about it. And then I contacted Pitter's lawyer, and he knew nothing about what was going on with that. So, as I said, I was in the Bodleian, and I was about to go back to America. I think it was my next to last day. Or no, I think it was a little bit earlier in the week, because I thought, well, what the heck? Maybe the Bodleian has Ruth Pitter's papers. So I went up to the gentleman I was working with and I said, do you have Ruth Pitter's papers? And he said, excuse me for this accent, David, but he said, well, of course we have Ruth Pitter's papers. And I got very excited and I said, well, can I see them? And he said, no, you may not. And I said, why? He said, they haven't been cataloged yet. And by this time they had Ruth Pitter's papers for about almost 10 years. So I kind of was down in the mouth about that. But they did have they had a single sheet of paper that described in one sentence what was in each of 36 boxes that they held of Ruth Pitter's papers. So I looked over that sheet, and after a couple of days, I went back to the gentleman I was working with, and I said, is there any chance you could let me look at these 3 boxes? Because if the transcriptions that I'm looking for exist, they will probably be in those last 3 boxes. So, and he agreed.
Begrudgingly.
No, not really. I won't make this too dramatic, but it was the day before I was getting ready to come back to the States that I opened one of Pitter's notebooks where she had written her poetry. These were transcriptions of her own poems. And there, sure enough, there were her transcriptions of the end of Perelandra. And I was, as you can imagine, very excited. It's sort of a dusty thing, but researchers get kind of excited. It's like a miner hitting a vein of oil or something. So that's how I found the transcriptions, and I was able to publish them in my book on Lewis as a poet, and then later on I republished them in my volume of Pitter's collected poems. So they're out there if anybody wants to take a closer look.
You just have to negotiate with an Englishman in the Bodleian. Sounds like a fun game.
He actually ended up being a pretty good friend after that experience.
Well, how do you think her poetry compares with Jack's prose? I mean, she is, after all, the professional poet.
As I thought about the transcriptions and compared them to Lewis's prose passages, I think that in general, I don't know that she necessarily improves on Lewis's prose, but I do think that she often sharpens and clarifies some of the things that Lewis is saying in those prose passages. And just to give an example or two, and I know your audience won't have these in front of you, so it might be difficult to follow, but I'll go ahead. In Pitter's passage or stanza 16, she communicates quite effectively, I think, the boundless love, mercy, and compassion of God that Lewis writes about in the prose, while at the same time refining the meaning a little bit of Lewis's original. So the passage in Perelandra that Lewis wrote reads this way: Each thing was made for him. He is the center cause. We are with him, each of us at the center. It is not as in the city of the darkened world where they say that each must live for all. In his city, all things are made for each. When he died in the wounded world, he died not for men, but for each man. If each man had been the only man made, he would have done no less. So here's Pitter's transcription of that same passage. He is the center, and each thing was made for him, and in him each thing forever dwells. Not as in the cities of the dark is said, each one for all, but utter love compels all to the service of each one. So tells the story of the wounded world. He came for each man, not for men. His miracles of strongest mercy would have been the same if but one living soul had dwelt there in that flame.
So good.
So Pitter's version loses the power of Lewis's line where he writes, because we are with him, each of us is at the center. But she considerably clarifies when Lewis writes, he died not for men, but for each man. If each man had not been the only man made, he would have done no less. He came for each man, not for men. His miracles of strongest mercy would have been the same if but one living soul had dwelt there in that flame. So I think in general, and again, we don't have time, obviously, to go through each one of the stanzas that she writes, but I think in general, Pitter's transcriptions configure Lewis's prose into poetic language and cadence, at times making his original more elegant. Here's one that Lewis himself singled out. This is Pitter's stanza 23. And Lewis singled it out, he said, for its, quote, high eloquence. So again, this is Pitter. Yet seeming also is the cause and end for which time is so long and heaven deep. Lest if we never meet the roads that tend nowhere, nor darkness, where the answers sleep to questions silence must forever keep. Nothing could image in our mind that sea, that gulf, and that abyss, the Father. Leap into that depth, O thoughts, only to be sunk drowned and echoless forever. Blessed be he. And here's Lewis's original. Yet this is seeming also in the end and final cause for which he spreads out, time so long and heaven so deep, lest if we never met the dark and the roads that leads nowhither, and the question to which no answer is imaginable, we should have in our minds no likeness of the abyss of the Father, into which, if a creature drop down his thoughts, forever shall hear no echo return to him. Blessed, blessed, blessed be he. So I think at least part of Pitter's success in making this passage more eloquent, again, as Lewis suggests, is her turning Lewis's difficult passage here, the questions to which no answer is imaginable, into the more memorable, and this is Pitter, where the answers sleep to questions silence must forever keep. Furthermore, Lewis's ambiguous phrase, abyss of the Father, is helped by the synonyms of sea and gulf. In brief, then, I think Lewis's prose concerning the great dance, and that's really what the last chapter of Perelandra is dealing with, was ore that Pitter often transformed into some poetic gold.
What I found when I was preparing to record our final episode on that chapter, I went back and reread all of Pitter's poetry, and I do feel it adds a good deal of clarity to that chapter.
Yeah.
We described it as a rich meal. Well, if Perelandra is a rich meal, that final chapter is like the densest, richest chocolate cake you've ever had. And so a little bit of whipped cream of Ruth Pitter really helped me in preparing for that one.
Man, I'm getting hungry now.
Well, any final thoughts before we wrap up today then?
Yeah, I'd like to make a few comments about what other critics had to say about the ending of Perelandra, or the writing of Perelandra, and then finish with two short poems by Pitter. Lest we think that Pitter's efforts at transcribing the end of Perelandra were presumptuous, self-indulgent, consider the criticism leveled at Lewis when the novel was first published. One critic wrote, "Bravely as Mr. Lewis has assaulted the high and mighty symbols of human hope, serious and imaginative as is his purpose, the things he intends cannot be done at the pace and within the structure of narrative prose. It is a subject and a verse at its most immense." So, I mean, that critic picks up on the fact that the end of that is very poetic. The reviewer, Kate O'Brien, added later that, quote, "Passages in this book which tremble near the absurd because they have to be so much explained might well have been majestic and beyond question in the simple, inevitable dress of poetry." I just love that line. So accordingly, Pitter's transcriptions, while faithful to the source, suggest both the underlying poetic nature of Lewis's prose in Perelandra and offer an attempt to turn it into verse. Pitter was a trusted confidant for Lewis the poet. In other letters to her, he expounded at length upon different kinds of poetry, the role of the individual poet, his deep love of Milton, his experiments in verse, and the hard subjects for poetry, and his favorite meters. Undoubtedly, Pitter was grateful to be a sounding board, thankful that she could in some small way repay Lewis for the broadcast talks that had helped her avoid the slough of despond she felt herself slipping into as World War I came to a close. Even after his death, she paid him a compliment by alluding to Perelandra in her volume of poetry Still by Choice, which was published in 1966. Her poem Angels speculates about the real character of an angel. She writes terrible, tender, or severe, and she overtly refers to Lewis's Eldilla. One of the last lines of her poem is, "Or likelier now we dream of space, Lewis's dread sublime, pillars of light, no limbs, no face, sickening our space and time." And then two short poems by Pitter. The verse is entitled If You Came. Pitter did not write much love poetry, and this poem was written in 1937, well before she knew Lewis. But when I first read this poem, I thought, boy, if Ruth Pitter could have written a poem to C.S. Lewis, a love poem, this might have been kind of like what she might have written. Anyway, again, If You Came. If you came to my secret glade, weary with heat, I would set you down in the shade, I would wash your feet. If you came in the winter sad, wanting for bread, I would give you the last that I had, I would give you my bed. But the place is hidden apart like a nest by a brook, and I will not show you my heart by a word, by a look. The place is hidden apart like the nest of a bird, and I will not show you my heart by a look, by a word. I just loved that poem the first time I read it, and because of the extensive research I did on Pitter, I found voice recordings of her reading that poem.
Mm.
When I read that poem to my wife, I said, is that really true about the way a woman feels? And she looked at me and she said, duh.
So this is a husband and wife who married for how many years now?
Yeah. And the second poem is Sudden Heaven, and I'm almost positive that this poem influenced Lewis's poem. I think it's entitled The Day with a White Mark. Anyway, this is Pitter's poem. All was as it had ever been. The worn familiar book, the oak beyond the hawthorn seen, the misty woodlands look. The starling perched upon the tree with his long tress of straw, when suddenly heaven blazed on me, and suddenly I saw all as it would ever be, in bliss too great to tell, forever safe, forever free, all bright with miracle. Saw as in heaven the thorn arrayed, the tree beside the door, and I must die, but oh, my shade shall dwell there evermore. Again, I just think a very powerful poem, kind of captures almost this notion of Jesus. I mean, it's not about Jesus on the cross, but there's like an allusion to that idea with the references to the thorn arrayed and so forth. But I'll stop now.
Mm. That was wonderful. Thank you. One of the things I was actually going to ask, if people have had their interest piqued about Ruth Pitter, where would you recommend they begin? And please feel free to segue into talking about the two books related to her that you've written.
I think maybe if I could just recommend two volumes of her poetry for your readers to take a look at. One would be entitled The Bridge, and that was a volume that she wrote during World War II. It's just a very profoundly moving collection of verse. She, of course, reflects on her experiences living through World War II. And then maybe Still by Choice, which I mentioned before, published in 1966. She had sort of stopped publishing poetry for a period of time. And the title of that book alludes to the idea that she chose to be still as a poet so that she could, I think, draw more deeply from her own experiences as she thought about where her life was going at that time. But all of her volumes are worth your readers or your listeners taking a look at. My other books on Ruth Pitter, I wrote a critical biography of Ruth Pitter entitled Hunting the Unicorn, a critical biography of Ruth Pitter. I just have to tell you that I loved working on that book so much because, David, most of the books that I've written because I got interested in the subject and there was nothing available. So I kind of wrote the book for myself, but I think some people have enjoyed reading it as well. But I dove deeply into the life and into the work of Ruth Pitter and just came away so refreshed by that experience and so appreciative of Pitter. She was the kind of poet that did not try to draw attention to herself, and yet she was recognized by a number of 20th century British luminaries, including Hilaire Belloc, would have probably been the primary one, but also Lord David Cecil was a real fan of Ruth Pitter, and there's wonderful correspondence between Pitter and David Cecil. David Cecil, of course, being an Inkling.
Yeah. And Hilaire Belloc being the friend of G.K. Chesterton, who in turn influenced Lewis. As is always the case, every time I dig into somebody who is Inklings adjacent, the web is incredibly tight.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. And the other book I wrote is a book of her collected letters. And I collected those letters when I was working on the biography, and I realized I had about 1,000 letters.
Whoa.
So it seemed very appropriate to publish those. So I ended up writing unintentionally a trilogy on Pitter. So I hope that, again, some of your readers will pick up on Pitter and enjoy her work. I still, even though those books are about 10 years old now, I still get probably one email a month from somebody somewhere in the world who's for the first time experienced reading Pitter. And they're sort of excited and they want to ask me some questions. So I find that quite satisfying to see that some people are still reading Pitter and appreciating her work.
Well, I have her penciled in for next season's Jack's Bookshelf. And when we go through and look at writers and books that shaped Lewis's life and thought. So I very much hope you'll come back and we'll do a deeper dive into her life and her poetry in season 9.
Sure. One more thing. Owen Barfield loved Ruth Pitter's poetry and had her visit him in London on a number of occasions, and sometimes Lewis would be there. So she really influenced several of the Inklings.
Well, I'll also make sure in the show notes that we've got some links to some of the recordings of her reading her own poetry. You mentioned one of them before. I hadn't heard that particular one, but I think on the Poetry Archive, they've got several of them. I know I've stumbled across one or two of them on YouTube. I find whenever we get to listen to somebody who knew Lewis reading their stuff, it actually really makes you realize none of this stuff actually happened that long ago.
Yeah.
And that if it hadn't perhaps been for shrapnel and poor diet and exercise, Lewis might have had a few more years left in him.
Yeah, good point.
I hear the call for final drinks, so thanks to our intern Julia, our sound engineers Taylor and Sarah, and of course, lots of thanks to Dr. Don W. King for talking to us today. Thanks to our Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier supporters, Dan, Jody, Robert, Mark, Mary Margaret, Rowdy, Angela, David, Peter, Kate, James, John, Sarah, Rebecca, Megan, Brian, Joanna, Kelly, Stephen, Gary, Paul, Kay, Becca, Shane, Thomas, Amanda, Joelle, Erica, Matt, James, Bud1, Bud2, Edgar, Aldo, Kevin, Mark, and of course, all of you for listening. So please join us next time when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers!
Cheers!